Why did my disabled dad point at my husband on our wedding day and say absolutely not? Anyone but you?
2 years ago, my dad and I were out celebrating in London.
Nothing fancy, just a basic day trip to toast his retirement. We were leaving the bar at 11 p.m. when 3 men in dark masks surrounded us in the alley. They had knives, they saw my designer bag and gold watch, and they lunged for me specifically. My dad jumped in the way. He told me to run while taking all 3 of them on at once. Before I could process what happened, the men were running away, and my dad was on the ground bleeding out. A knife was sticking out of his lower back. I dropped to my knees and called the ambulance, holding his face and begging him to stay with me. His eyes shut as he was loaded into the ambulance. He went into a coma where nobody knew if he'd ever wake up. 2 years later, a miracle happened. He woke up 1 week before my wedding. Despite the doctor's orders, he checked himself out and booked a flight to where I now lived so he could attend. My wedding was the first time he'd ever see Roger, my fiancé. My dad was in a wheelchair, but him accompanying me down the aisle was a dream come true. I'd never been happier than when the ceremony doors opened and I walked out with my dad. I saw Roger's reaction first. His eyes went wide and not in a good way. Then my dad got a closer look at Roger's face. Suddenly he pulled his hand away. I felt my dad shaking, hyperventilating. He was turning gray, pointing his finger at Roger, yelling, "No. Anyone but you. God, anyone but you. Why are you marrying my daughter?" The music had cut, and before he could say anything else, he clutched his chest. He started wheezing, his eyes rolled back. My dad was having a heart attack while walking me down the aisle at my own wedding. Chaos. Screams. Everyone called the ambulance at once. At the hospital, I found myself still in my wedding dress, as the doctors told me he had gone into another coma. In between all the sadness and confusion, I had so many questions. Did my dad and Roger know each other? What had Roger done? Was I safe around him? He kept saying he'd never met my father. But how could I believe him? The next day, while in the hospital, I noticed a scar on my dad's exposed thigh. I'd seen it before, but never really looked or asked about it. "Mom, what's this scar?" She quickly glanced at it. "Snowboarding accident when he was young. But Dad hated the cold, and the scar looked like a stab wound." I went to Roger's flat while he was at work the next day. I found a box tucked away in the closet. Inside were newspaper clippings about my dad's attack 2 years ago, articles about the trial, photos of Dad unconscious in hospital. Why would Roger have these? When he came home and saw me holding them, his hands fidgeted like he was nervous. "Why do you have articles about my father?" I researched your family before meeting them," he stammered out. Then he grabbed his keys and left. I drove straight to his mother's house. "Has Roger ever been to London?" She hesitated. "No, he's never been overseas." "Are you sure?" Her hands started trembling. "You need to talk to Roger." She closed the door. Back at Roger's flat, I searched deeper. Hidden under clothes, I found old court documents. From 15 years ago. Most details were blocked out, but I could read a few. Assault charge, juvenile, case sealed. Roger had hurt someone when he was younger. I was driving myself crazy trying to figure it out when the hospital called. Dad was miraculously awake. I dropped to my knees and cried. He was alive. I rushed there immediately, but when I got to his room, he wasn't really awake. His eyes were open, but he was drooling and couldn't speak. When I held his hand and told him it was me, he didn't say a word. "Severe brain damage," the doctor said. "Vegetative state, he can't communicate." I held his hand and cried. 2 days later, I was in Roger's place again, searching. And hidden in a book, I found an old photo. A young woman holding a baby. The back said, "Don't forget where you came from." I showed it to Rogers. "Who is this?" She started crying. "That's Roger's real mom. My sister. She died 3 years ago." I couldn't believe it. The woman I thought was Roger's mother was actually his aunt. "Why would he hide this?" I asked. "It's not my place to tell you." She was sobbing now. "But please talk to him. You deserve the truth." I called Roger from the hospital the next morning. "Can you please come down? I have questions about your past." I could hear him literally gulp, but he had no other choice. He met me in the hospital cafeteria 20 minutes later. "Tell me the truth." His lip quivered like he was crying. Then he broke completely. "I'm your father's son." My coffee mug crashed onto the table. "My father's son? What do you mean?" Roger continued. "Your dad left my mom when I was a baby. When I was 13, I found him. I blamed him for how bad my life was. I was angry and I stabbed him. My chest tightened and my knees buckled. Did you know before meeting me?" I asked. His mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. I watched his face turn red, then white, then red again while my coffee spread across the table in a brown pool that dripped onto the floor. He started to reach toward me but stopped halfway, his hand shaking in the air between us. The words finally came out broken and quiet. He said he didn't know at first, that he met me at the bookshop by accident, that we started dating before he realized who my father was. My legs gave out completely, and I grabbed the edge of the table but missed, landing hard in the nearest chair. The plastic seat felt cold through my wedding dress. Roger kept talking, saying he figured it out 3 months into our relationship when I mentioned my dad being in a coma in London, that he'd wanted to tell me but didn't know how, that he thought maybe it was fate bringing us together. I couldn't breathe right. The cafeteria walls seemed to close in while other people at nearby tables stared at us. My whole body started shaking so hard my teeth chattered. Roger reached across the table for my hand, and his fingers touched mine for just a second before I jerked my arm back like he'd burned me. I stood up fast, the chair scraping loud against the floor. My voice came out louder than I meant when I told him not to say another word, to stop talking, to just stop. He tried to stand too, but I put my hand up. I told him I needed to leave right now and he needed to stay away from me. Then I turned and walked toward the cafeteria exit on legs that felt like they might fold under me any second. Each step took effort, like walking through water. I pushed through the double doors into the corridor, and Caroline was right there waiting because I'd texted her during the chaos. She took one look at my face and wrapped her arms around me. I pressed my face into her shoulder and tried not to scream because we were still in a hospital, and my dad was somewhere upstairs dying, and I'd just learned I was engaged to my half-brother who'd stabbed our father. Caroline didn't ask questions, just held me while I shook. After a minute, she guided me toward the exit, her arm tight around my waist like she thought I might collapse. We made it to her car in the parking garage, and she opened the passenger door, helping me in like I was elderly or injured. The drive to her flat took 20 minutes through afternoon traffic. I stared out the window, watching normal people doing normal things, walking dogs and buying groceries, and I couldn't understand how the world was still functioning when mine had just exploded. Caroline kept one hand on my knee the whole drive, squeezing it every few minutes. When we pulled up to her building, Tony was already standing outside waiting. Caroline must have texted him. He opened my car door and his face was full of concern, but he didn't ask anything either, just helped me out and up the stairs to their second-floor flat. Inside, their guest room door was open, and I could see fresh sheets on the bed, a glass of water on the nightstand. Caroline led me to the sofa instead and sat beside me. I was still wearing my wedding dress, this huge white thing with lace and beading that had cost 2,000 pounds. It felt like a costume now, like evidence of how stupid I'd been. Caroline started working on the tiny buttons running down my back, her fingers gentle and patient, even though there were maybe 50 of them. Tony disappeared into the bedroom and came back with sweatpants and a t-shirt. When Caroline finally got all the buttons undone, she helped me stand and step out of the dress. I stood there in my underwear and veil, still wearing the veil, until Tony gently reached up and unpinned it from my hair. Caroline handed me the borrowed clothes and I pulled them on. The sweatpants were too big and I had to roll the waistband 3 times. I sat back down on the sofa and Tony brought me tea that I didn't drink. That night I lay in their guest bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep felt impossible. My brain kept replaying Roger's confession over and over, his voice saying he was my father's son, that he'd stabbed Dad when he was 13. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and turned on the bedside lamp. Caroline had left a notebook and pen on the dresser, probably knowing I'd need them. I sat up in bed and started writing everything down. I wrote the date Roger and I met, 18 months ago at that bookshop in Bloomsbury. I wrote down when we started dating officially, 3 months later. I wrote down the timeline of Dad's attack in London, 2 years ago. I wrote down everything I'd found in Roger's flat, the newspaper clippings about Dad's attack, the articles about the trial for the muggers who were never caught, the photos of Dad unconscious in his hospital bed. I wrote down the court documents from 15 years ago, the sealed juvenile assault charge. I wrote down Roger's aunt's evasions, her trembling hands, her refusal to answer my questions. I wrote down the photo of the young woman holding a baby with the note on the back. I filled 6 pages trying to see a pattern, trying to understand if Roger had planned this whole thing, or if it really was horrible coincidence. The numbers didn't make sense for planning. Roger was 13 when he stabbed Dad 15 years ago. I was 8 years old then, just a kid. How could he have planned to meet me decades later? But the clippings and photos showed he'd been following Dad's life, tracking him. Did he know Dad had a daughter? Did he find me on purpose? My head hurt from thinking in circles. I wrote until my hand cramped and the sky outside started turning gray with dawn. The next morning, I called my mother from Caroline's kitchen, while she and Tony pretended not to listen from the living room. Mum answered on the second ring, her voice rough with sleep. I told her everything Roger had confessed, the words tumbling out fast. I told her Roger claimed to be Dad's son, that Dad had left his mother when Roger was a baby, that Roger had tracked Dad down at 13 and stabbed him. There was a long silence on the other end. So long I thought the call had dropped. Then Mum made a sound like she was crying or maybe choking. She said she knew Dad had a son somewhere. My stomach dropped even further, which I hadn't thought was possible. She explained that Dad had told her decades ago, before they got married, about a brief relationship with a woman who got pregnant. He'd admitted he wasn't ready to be a father and had cut off contact. Mum said she'd encouraged him to reach out over the years, but he'd refused, said it was too late, that the boy was better off without him. She'd never known the boy's name or that he'd attacked Dad in London. Her voice shook when she said if she'd known, she would have told me, would have protected me from this. I asked her the question that had kept me up all night. Did Dad know Roger was his son during those 2 years in the coma? Mum said no, absolutely not. Dad had never met the boy after he was born. She said the stabbing in London 2 years ago must have been the first time they'd been in the same place since Roger was an infant, and Dad had been unconscious within minutes of the attack. There was no way Dad could have known Roger was his attacker or his son until the wedding day when he saw Roger's face and recognized him. That's why Dad had reacted so strongly, why he'd had the heart attack right there in the aisle. Mum started crying harder then, and I had to hang up because I couldn't handle her grief on top of my own. My phone started buzzing constantly after that. Text after text from Roger. I'm so sorry. Please let me explain. I never meant to hurt you. It wasn't planned. I love you. Please talk to me. The messages kept coming, filling my screen. Caroline saw me staring at my phone and gently took it from my hands. She asked if I wanted to block his number, and I nodded. She did it right there, her fingers quick on the screen. She said I needed space to think clearly, that whatever Roger wanted to say could wait until I was ready to hear it, and right now I couldn't trust anything that came out of his mouth. She was right. How could I believe anything he said when he'd lied to me for 18 months? When he'd hidden who he was, what he'd done, how we were connected? I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. I'd been sleeping next to my half-brother, kissing him, planning a future with him, and I'd never suspected anything was wrong. I went back to the hospital that afternoon because I needed to see Dad, needed to confirm he was still alive even if he wasn't really there. His room was on the 4th floor in the intensive care unit. When I walked in, he looked exactly the same as yesterday, lying flat on his back with machines beeping around him. His eyes were half open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Drool had dried at the corner of his mouth. I sat in the chair beside his bed and took his hand. It was warm but limp. No response when I squeezed his fingers. Dr. Ingrid Molina came in a few minutes later with a tablet computer and a kind face. She introduced herself as Dad's neurologist and asked if she could explain his condition. I nodded and she sat in the other chair, turning the tablet to show me brain scans. She explained that the heart attack at the wedding had caused oxygen deprivation. Dad's brain had been without proper oxygen for several minutes before the paramedics got his heart restarted. The damage was significant, particularly to the areas controlling consciousness and higher functions. She used the term minimally conscious state, which meant Dad had very limited awareness. He might be able to track movement with his eyes sometimes or respond to pain, but he couldn't communicate or understand what was happening around him. She said his brain activity was minimal, just enough to keep his body functioning. The machines were monitoring everything, his heart rate and breathing and brainwaves. I asked Dr. Molina if Dad could have recognized Roger at the wedding. She tilted her head, thinking about it. She said it was possible his deeper memory had triggered a stress response even if his conscious mind couldn't process it fully. The brain stores traumatic memories differently than regular ones, she explained. Dad might have seen Roger's face and had an automatic physical reaction, his body remembering the attack even if he couldn't consciously identify why he was afraid. The shock of seeing his attacker could absolutely have caused the heart attack, especially given how fragile Dad's condition was after just waking from a 2-year coma. His body had barely started recovering from the first trauma when the second one hit. Dr. Molina said the combination of physical stress and psychological shock had been too much for his system to handle. She looked at me with sympathy and said she was sorry, that she knew this was incredibly difficult. I thanked her and sat with Dad for another hour, holding his hand and trying to accept that this was probably all I'd ever have of him now, this shell of a person who couldn't hear me or know I was there. Dr. Molina stayed in the room after explaining Dad's condition, and she pulled her chair closer to mine. She said we needed to discuss practical matters, and I appreciated that she didn't sugarcoat anything or pretend this was temporary. She explained that Roger's claim about being Dad's son raised legal questions about family relationships and medical decision-making. If Roger really was Dad's biological child, he might have rights regarding Dad's care or estate, and we needed to establish the truth before making any permanent decisions. She could arrange DNA testing using a blood sample from Dad, and Mum would need to consent as next of kin, since Dad couldn't make decisions for himself. The test would take about a week to process, and the results would give us clarity about the family situation. I nodded and said I'd talk to Mum about it, and Dr. Molina squeezed my shoulder before leaving me alone with Dad again. I sat there for another 20 minutes watching the machines beep and hiss. Then I texted Caroline asking if she knew any lawyers who handled family cases. She responded immediately with a name and number, and she offered to come with me to any meetings if I needed support. I left the hospital as the sun was setting and drove to Caroline's flat where Tony had made dinner. I couldn't eat much, but I sat at their table and told them everything Dr. Molina had said about DNA testing and legal complications. Caroline wrote down the solicitor's information and called her right then, explaining the situation and asking for an urgent appointment. The solicitor, Portia Bennett, agreed to meet me that same evening at her office downtown. Tony drove me there because my hands were shaking too much to trust myself behind the wheel. Portia's office was in a converted townhouse with warm lighting and comfortable furniture that didn't feel like a typical law office. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking that I found calming. I sat across from her desk and told her the whole story from the beginning, starting with Dad's attack in London 2 years ago and ending with Roger's confession in the hospital cafeteria that morning. She took notes on a yellow legal pad and didn't interrupt once. And when I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with genuine sympathy. She said I was dealing with multiple crises at once and we needed to secure my legal position immediately before Roger or his family tried to complicate things further. First priority was the DNA test that Dr. Molina suggested, because we needed to confirm whether Roger actually was Dad's son or if he was lying to manipulate me. Second priority was ending my engagement to Roger through annulment rather than just breaking up, because annulment would legally erase the relationship as if it never existed. Third priority was establishing clear guardianship over Dad's medical care so that only Mom and I could make decisions about his treatment. Portia explained that if Roger turned out to be Dad's biological son, he could theoretically claim rights to participate in medical decisions or challenge any estate planning, and we needed to get ahead of that possibility. She asked if Roger had ever been violent toward me, and I said no, but she suggested we consider a restraining order anyway, given his history of stabbing Dad and his current emotional state. I told her I'd think about it, and she said that was fine, but I should document every interaction with Roger from now on in case I needed evidence later. She pulled out several forms and explained each one in simple terms. The guardianship papers would give Mum and me joint authority over Dad's care, and they required a doctor's statement confirming Dad couldn't make his own decisions. The annulment paperwork cited fraud and misrepresentation as grounds, since Roger had hidden his true identity and relationship to my family throughout our entire engagement. Portia said Roger would have to be served with the annulment papers and he could contest it, but given the circumstances, most judges would grant it without much argument. I signed everything she put in front of me, and my signature looked shaky and unfamiliar on the official documents. Portia made copies for her files and promised to file the guardianship and annulment paperwork first thing tomorrow morning. She said the DNA test was smart not just for emotional closure, but for legal protection. Because if Roger was Dad's son, we needed to establish that fact officially before his family hired lawyers and tried to claim rights they might not be entitled to. Tony drove me back to Caroline's flat around 9 that night, and I felt exhausted in a way that went beyond just being tired. Caroline had made up the guest bed with fresh sheets and left a glass of water on the nightstand, and I collapsed onto the mattress still wearing my clothes. My phone buzzed with a call from my work supervisor, and I almost didn't answer but knew I couldn't avoid it forever. She asked when I'd be returning to the office, and I had to explain that my wedding had turned into a family emergency with my father in intensive care. She made sympathetic noises and said she understood, but then she reminded me that I'd already used all my vacation time for the wedding and honeymoon. Any additional leave would be unpaid, and if I needed more than 2 weeks, I'd have to apply for family medical leave, which required extensive paperwork. I felt panic rising in my chest because I couldn't afford unpaid leave, but I also couldn't abandon Dad or deal with all the legal matters while working full-time. She said she'd hold my position for 2 weeks and we could discuss options after that, and I thanked her before hanging up and wanting to scream. Caroline knocked on the door and came in without waiting for an answer, and she sat on the edge of the bed looking at me with concern. She said I needed to talk to someone professional about everything happening, not just lean on friends who didn't know how to help with trauma this complex. She gave me a business card for Raven Armstrong, a therapist who specialized in family betrayal and complicated grief situations. I pushed the card away and said I didn't need therapy. I just needed to get through each day and handle the practical problems in front of me. Caroline picked up the card and put it back in my hand, and she said I was living through multiple crises at the same time and trying to handle everything alone. Dad's attack 2 years ago, his coma, his shocking recovery, his second collapse, and Roger's revelation were all separate traumas happening on top of each other, and I needed professional help to process them without falling apart completely. I looked at the card with Raven Armstrong's name and phone number printed in simple black text, and I admitted that Caroline was probably right, even though the idea of therapy felt like admitting I was broken. She hugged me and said therapy wasn't about being broken. It was about getting tools to handle impossible situations, and then she left me alone to sleep. I called Raven Armstrong the next morning and explained that I needed an appointment as soon as possible. Her voice on the phone was calm and warm, and she said she had an opening that afternoon if I could make it. I arrived at her office in a building near the city center, and the waiting room had soft chairs and magazines I didn't bother looking at. Raven came out to get me herself instead of sending a receptionist, and she was a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair and an expression that made me feel like I could say anything without being judged. Her office had a couch and 2 armchairs, and I chose an armchair because the couch felt too much like lying down for analysis. She asked me to tell her what happened in my own words, and I started with the wedding day and walking down the aisle with Dad. I got through maybe 1 sentence before I started crying, and then I couldn't stop. She handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I sobbed, and when I finally caught my breath, she said it was okay to cry and I should take all the time I needed. I told her everything in a jumbled rush, jumping around in the timeline and probably not making much sense, but she followed along and asked clarifying questions when needed. When I finished, she explained that I was experiencing what she called layered trauma, where multiple traumatic events stack on top of each other without time to process any of them individually. Dad's attack in London 2 years ago was the first trauma, then his 2-year coma, then his miraculous recovery, then his collapse at my wedding, and finally Roger's revelation about being my half-brother who had stabbed our father. Each of those events would be enough to overwhelm anyone on its own, but I'd lived through all of them in rapid succession without proper support or processing time. She taught me a breathing exercise for panic attacks, having me breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6 counts, while focusing on the physical sensation of air moving through my body. She said we'd work on deeper emotional processing later, but right now the priority was immediate safety and basic stability. I needed to feel physically safe, know where I was sleeping each night, have a plan for handling Roger if he contacted me, and build a support network of people I could call in crisis moments.
We spent the rest of the session creating what she called a safety plan, and she wrote everything down on a worksheet she gave me to take home.
I would stay at Caroline's flat for now instead of going back to the flat I'd shared with Roger. I would change all my passwords for email, banking, and social media in case Roger had access to any of them. I would document every contact from Roger, saving texts and emails and writing down phone calls with dates and times. I would identify 3 people I could call at any time if I felt unsafe or overwhelmed, and I wrote down Caroline, Tony, and my mom. Raven emphasized that I wasn't responsible for Roger's choices or Dad's past decisions, and my only job right now was protecting myself while managing Dad's immediate care needs. Everything else could wait until I had stable ground under my feet. She scheduled me for twice-weekly appointments and said I could call her emergency line if I needed support between sessions. I left her office feeling slightly less like I was drowning, and I drove back to the hospital to check on Dad and talk to Mom about the DNA testing. Mom was sitting beside Dad's bed when I arrived, and I explained what Dr. Melina and Portia had both said about needing official confirmation of Roger's claim. She agreed to sign the consent forms, and Dr. Melina arranged for the blood draw that afternoon. The lab technician came in with her supplies and took 3 vials of blood from Dad's arm while he lay there completely unaware of what was happening. Dr. Melina said the results would take about a week to process, and she'd call us as soon as they came back. That week passed in a strange fog where I moved through each day on autopilot. I visited Dad every morning, sitting beside his bed for an hour and talking to him even though he couldn't hear or respond. I met with Portia twice to review paperwork and discuss next steps for the annulment and guardianship. I went to therapy with Raven on Tuesday and Thursday, and we worked on breathing exercises and identifying my emotional triggers. I stayed at Caroline's flat and avoided going anywhere I might run into Roger or his aunt. Caroline and Tony were endlessly patient, never making me feel like I was imposing, even though I was clearly disrupting their normal life. I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time, and I kept forgetting simple things like whether I'd eaten lunch or what day of the week it was. One evening around 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang at Caroline's flat, and I froze on the sofa because I wasn't expecting anyone. Tony looked at me and I shook my head fast, so he motioned for me to go to the bedroom while he answered the door. I crept down the hallway and stood behind the bedroom door with my heart pounding, listening to Tony open the front door and speak to someone in a low voice. I heard a woman's voice that I recognized as Roger's aunt, and she said she needed to give me something important. Tony told her I wasn't available right now, but he would make sure I got whatever she brought. There was a pause, then the sound of something being handed over, and Tony thanked her and said he would pass it along. The door closed and I heard his footsteps coming toward the bedroom. He held out a small cardboard box, maybe the size of a shoebox, with my name written on top in shaky handwriting. I took it from him and sat on the bed staring at it for a full minute before I could make myself open the lid. Inside were letters, maybe 20 of them, all in envelopes addressed to a woman named Sarah with an address in Manchester. The return address on each envelope was my parents' old flat in London from 30 years ago. I pulled out the first letter and unfolded it with trembling hands. The date at the top was from before I was born, and the handwriting was definitely my dad's. He wrote about being excited and scared about the pregnancy, about wanting to do the right thing but not knowing what that meant. The second letter was dated 2 months later, and his tone had shifted to worried, talking about not being ready for this responsibility and needing more time to figure things out. I read through them one by one in order by date, and watched my father's voice change from hopeful to guilty, to distant, to completely absent. The 10th letter mentioned sending money to help with expenses, and the 15th letter said he couldn't be involved anymore, that it was too complicated with his new relationship with my mom. The last letter included a check for £5,000 and a note saying this would be the final payment, that he wished Sarah and the baby well, but he needed to move forward with his life. I felt sick reading those words, seeing proof that my dad knew about Roger and chose to walk away completely. He sent money once like that made it okay. Then he disappeared and left Roger's mother to raise a baby alone in poverty until she died when Roger was 10 years old. The letters mentioned her struggling to pay rent, working 2 jobs, asking Dad to please just meet his son once, but he never responded after that final check. I understood Roger's anger better now, understood why a 13-year-old boy would track down the father who abandoned him and lash out in rage. But understanding the context didn't excuse what Roger did to our dad, or the lies he told me for 18 months. He stabbed our father when he was 13 after hunting him down. Then years later, he somehow found me and built an entire relationship without ever revealing who he was or what he had done. The calculation of it made my stomach turn. I put the letters back in the box and shoved it under the bed because I couldn't look at them anymore. 3 days later, Portia called and asked me to come to her office because the DNA results had arrived. I drove there in a daze and sat across from her desk while she opened a manila envelope and pulled out several pages of lab results. She scanned through the technical language and then looked up at me with a serious expression. The test confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Roger and my dad shared a biological parent-child relationship. I sat there reading the official report that made this nightmare real, black and white proof that I had been engaged to my half-brother, that our father had abandoned his first child completely, and that this secret had shaped all our lives in ways we were only beginning to understand. Portia asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't, and she filed the report in my case folder and said we now had legal documentation if we needed it for the annulment or any future proceedings. I left her office and drove to the hospital to see Dad, needing to look at him and process what he had done. He lay in his bed with his eyes half open and drool on his chin, completely unaware of the chaos his choices had created. I was sitting beside his bed when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a man's voice introduced himself as Detective Edward Pratt from the London Metropolitan Police. He said he had been reviewing the case file for my dad's attack 2 years ago, after learning about Roger's confession at the hospital, and he wanted to meet with me to discuss some questions that had come up during his review. My chest tightened because I realized what he was asking. He wanted to know if Roger could have been involved in the mugging that put Dad in the first coma. I agreed to meet him the next morning at a coffee shop near the hospital. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat at a corner table, watching the door until a man in his 50s walked in wearing a gray suit and carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself as Detective Pratt and ordered a coffee before sitting across from me. He opened a notebook and explained that the 3 masked muggers from 2 years ago were never caught or identified. The case had gone cold after a few months with no leads, but now with Roger's confession about stabbing Dad at 13, he wanted to explore whether there might be a connection between Roger and the mugging. He asked detailed questions about Roger's whereabouts 2 years ago, whether Roger had known where Dad would be that night in London, and if I had any evidence suggesting Roger might have planned or participated in the attack. I told him about the newspaper clippings and photos Roger kept in his flat, the articles about Dad's condition, and the trial coverage. I explained that Roger had clearly been tracking Dad's condition after the attack, following the news coverage and saving everything in a box hidden in his closet. But I honestly didn't know if Roger had been in London that night, or if he had anything to do with the mugging. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The thought that he might have hired those men or participated in attacking us made me physically ill, and I had to put my coffee down because my hands were shaking too much to hold it. Detective Pratt wrote everything down in his notebook and said the newspaper clippings were concerning because they showed Roger had a continued interest in Dad after the attack. He asked if I knew whether Roger had traveled to London around that time, or if he had any connections to people who might have carried out the attack for him. I said I had no idea about his movements 2 years ago because we hadn't met yet, and I didn't know anything about his associates, or whether he knew people who would do something like that. Detective Pratt closed his notebook and said he would investigate Roger's alibi for that night and review the original case evidence for any new connections to Roger. He warned me that even if Roger was involved in planning or carrying out the mugging, proving it would be very difficult without witnesses or physical evidence linking him to the scene. But he wanted to explore every angle given the family connection and Roger's documented history of violence against Dad. He gave me his card and asked me to call if I remembered anything else that might be relevant. I drove back to Caroline's flat and couldn't focus on anything for the rest of the day. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep, my mind racing through the possibility that Roger had planned the first attack. If he tracked Dad down at 13 and stabbed him out of anger, could he have hired people to attack us in London 2 years ago? Was I always part of some revenge plot? Or did he really fall in love with me not knowing who I was? The coincidence of us meeting felt too perfect now, too convenient, and I couldn't stop thinking about how Roger had pursued me so intensely when we first met. He had asked me so many questions about my family, about where I grew up, about my parents. Had he known the whole time? Had he been playing me from the start, getting close to Dad's daughter as some twisted form of revenge? Or was it really just horrible luck that he fell for his half-sister without knowing? I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but the newspaper clippings kept haunting me, proof that he had been obsessed with Dad's condition after the attack. Why keep those articles unless he had some personal investment in what happened? The questions circled in my head all night and I didn't sleep at all, just stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of how my life had turned into this nightmare. Roger's face went white and he shook his head fast. No, I swear I didn't know. I met you at that bookshop on Market Street, remember? You were looking for a gift for your mom's birthday and we started talking about mystery novels. I had no idea who your family was. I stood up from the table, my whole body shaking. I need to leave. Don't contact me. I walked out of that cafeteria and didn't look back even though I heard him calling my name behind me. Caroline picked me up outside the hospital and drove me back to her flat where I spent the next 3 days barely eating or sleeping, just lying in the guest bed staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything. But one question kept eating at me until I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my phone and broke the no-contact rule I'd set for myself, typing out a text to Roger with shaking hands. Were you involved in the London mugging 2 years ago? Did you hire those men? Tell me the truth. My phone buzzed within 30 seconds. No. I swear on everything I had nothing to do with that. I didn't even know where Dad was until I saw it on the news after the attack happened. Meeting you was pure terrible coincidence, you have to believe me. I stared at his response for a long time. More texts came through. Please let me explain everything in person. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I need you to hear the whole story. I'll meet you anywhere public. Anywhere you feel safe. Please. I shouldn't have agreed, but I needed answers more than I needed to protect myself from more pain. I texted back that I'd think about it and turned my phone off before he could respond again. The next morning, I had my regular therapy appointment with Raven. I'd started seeing her right after Dad's first attack 2 years ago when I couldn't stop having panic attacks, and she'd helped me through the worst of it. Now I was back in her office dealing with a completely different nightmare. I'm thinking about meeting with Roger, I told her. He wants to explain everything, and part of me needs to hear it even though I know it's probably a terrible idea. Raven leaned forward in her chair. If you do meet him, we need to set very clear boundaries first. You'll meet in a public place, you'll tell someone where you're going, and you'll have an exit plan if things get too intense. Roger may try to manipulate your emotions or make you feel guilty for not forgiving him right away. We spent the rest of the session preparing questions I wanted to ask, and practicing how to stay firm on my boundaries even if Roger cried or got upset. Raven helped me write out a list on my phone so I wouldn't forget what I needed to know in the moment. When I left her office, I felt slightly more prepared, though still terrified of hearing whatever Roger had to say. I called Detective Pratt before I contacted Roger, telling him I was planning to meet my ex and wanted him to know in case anything went wrong. He asked me to text him the location and time, and he said he'd have an officer nearby just to be safe. Then I texted Roger and told him I'd meet him at the cafe on Pine Street at 2 p.m. the next day, the one with big windows facing the street where lots of people would be around. He responded immediately saying he'd be there and thanking me for giving him a chance to explain. The next afternoon, I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early and picked a table near the window where I could see Roger coming. He showed up right at 2 p.m. looking absolutely terrible, like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were red and puffy, his clothes were wrinkled, and he'd lost weight since I last saw him. He sat down across from me and immediately started talking. Thank you for meeting me. I know you don't owe me anything after what I did. I held up my hand to stop him. Just tell me everything from the beginning. When did you find Dad and what happened? Roger took a shaky breath. My mom died when I was 10. Cancer. We were really poor and she worked 2 jobs trying to keep us fed, and by the time they found the cancer, it was too late. Before she died, she told me about my father, gave me his name and the last address she had for him. I was so angry after she died. Angry at everything, but especially at him for leaving us to struggle alone. He paused and wiped his eyes. When I was 13, I tracked him down. It took me 3 years of searching online and asking questions, but I finally found where he lived. I showed up at his house one day after school. He answered the door and I told him who I was, that I was his son and my mom had just died. He looked at me like I was some stranger trying to scam him. He said he didn't know what I was talking about and tried to close the door. I lost it. I had this knife in my backpack that I carried for protection in my neighborhood and I just snapped. I stabbed him in the thigh and ran away before he could grab me. Roger's hands were shaking as he continued. The police caught me 2 days later. I was arrested and charged with assault. Because I was a minor, they sealed the records and I spent 18 months in juvenile detention. That's where my aunt found me. She's my mom's sister and she'd been trying to locate me after Mom died, but I'd been bouncing around foster homes. She got custody of me when I was released and moved us away from London to give me a fresh start. She got me into therapy, helped me finish school, and I really thought I'd moved past all that anger. He looked up at me with tears running down his face. Then 2 years ago, I was watching the news and I saw the story about a man who'd been attacked in London protecting his daughter from muggers. They showed his photo and I recognized him immediately. It was Dad. Seeing him on the news like that, knowing he'd been hurt again, it brought everything back. I became obsessed with following the story, collecting articles, checking for updates on his condition. I needed to know if he survived, if he woke up, what happened to him. The clippings weren't about revenge. They were about me trying to understand this man who abandoned me and who I'd hurt so badly. I pulled out my phone and looked at my list of questions. When did you realize I was Dad's daughter? Roger met my eyes. Not until the wedding day, I swear. When we met at that bookshop, it was completely random. You told me your name was Debbie Harrison. You talked about your mom, but you never mentioned your father, or that he was in a coma in London. We started dating and it felt natural and real. You used your mom's last name, so I had no way to connect you to him. I didn't know anything about Dad having another family or a daughter. When the wedding doors opened and I saw him in that wheelchair being pushed down the aisle, I recognized him instantly, and my whole world just stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. Then he saw my face and he knew me too, and I watched him have a heart attack right there, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Why didn't you tell me the truth as soon as you realized? I asked. Roger shook his head. I should have. I know I should have stopped everything right then and told you who I was, but I panicked. Everything was happening so fast and there were so many people watching and I just froze. By the time I could think clearly enough to say something, Dad was on the ground and the ambulance was called and it was too late to fix anything. Watching him collapse was horrible because I never wanted to hurt him again, and seeing you in so much pain destroyed me. I love you and I'd just caused you the worst day of your life. I asked him about the clippings again, pushing for a better answer. Roger looked down at his hands. I never fully processed what I did when I was 13. The therapy helped me function and move on with my life, but I never really dealt with the guilt or the anger at Dad for abandoning us. The clippings were my way of monitoring him from far away, making sure he survived, trying to understand who he was without actually having to face him. I know that sounds messed up, but it's the truth. I wasn't planning anything or plotting revenge. I was just trying to make sense of what happened between us. After an hour of talking, Roger left to use the bathroom and Detective Pratt came into the cafe. He'd been waiting outside the whole time, watching through the window. I need to interview him separately about his whereabouts during the London mugging, he said.
Can you ask him to stay when he comes back?
When Roger returned, I told him the detective needed to speak with him, and Roger agreed immediately. They went to a different table while I waited, watching them talk for another 30 minutes. Finally, Detective Pratt came back over to me.
He's provided an alibi for the night of the attack. He was at work 2 hours away, clocked in from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. with multiple witnesses.
I'll verify it through his employment records and talk to his coworkers, but based on his initial statement, I don't think he was involved in the mugging. There's no evidence connecting him to the scene or to the men who attacked you, and your father. Over the next few days, Detective Pratt checked Roger's story thoroughly, pulling work records and interviewing 3 different people who remembered Roger being at his job that entire night. He called me with the results. Roger's alibi holds up completely. He was nowhere near London when your father was attacked. I've reviewed the original case file, and there's no connection between Roger and the muggers. It appears to have been a random street crime, exactly like we thought at the time. I felt this weird sense of relief wash over me. Roger didn't plan the attack that put Dad in a coma.
He didn't hire those men or set us up to be robbed.
The London mugging really was just terrible luck, and meeting me afterward really was just horrible coincidence. But that relief didn't change what Roger did when he was 13, or the lies he told me for 18 months. It didn't change that I'd been engaged to my half-brother without knowing it, or that Dad was now in another coma because Roger kept his identity secret. I called Portia and asked her to contact Roger with a message from me. Tell him I need him to stay away from me and Dad. I need time to process everything without his presence making it harder. I can't have him around while I'm grieving and trying to figure out what happens next. Portia called me back an hour later. Roger agrees to a complete no-contact period. He says he'll give you all the space you need and he won't try to reach out unless you contact him first. He's also enrolling in intensive therapy to work through his unresolved trauma around your father's abandonment. He wants you to know he takes full responsibility for his choices, and he's not asking for forgiveness, just understanding when you're ready. 2 days later, Portia forwarded me a letter that Roger's aunt had sent to her office. I opened it sitting on Caroline's sofa with my hands shaking. The letter started with an apology for keeping secrets and explained that she'd been trying to protect Roger from his painful past. She described finding Roger in juvenile detention after her sister died, how broken and angry he was, how she'd moved them away from London and gotten him help so he could have a chance at a normal life. She wrote about watching him grow into a kind person who seemed to have moved past his trauma, and how shocked she was when she realized he'd gotten involved with his father's daughter without knowing who she was. The letter ended with an offer to help facilitate communication between Roger and me if I ever wanted it, and a phone number where I could reach her directly. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not ready to think about future communication, but glad to have the full picture of what Roger's life had been like after he stabbed Dad. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what the aunt wrote, so I pulled the letter back out and read it properly from start to finish. She described finding Roger in a group home after his mom died, how the social workers said he'd been bouncing between foster placements for months because nobody could handle his anger. He'd gotten into fights at the school, destroyed property, refused to follow any rules. The aunt wrote that she barely recognized him as the sweet little boy she remembered from before her sister got sick. She took him in anyway, and moved them 3 hours away from London, to get him away from the places that reminded him of his mum. She enrolled him in therapy twice a week, and got him into a youth program that taught him carpentry, and gave him somewhere to put his energy besides breaking things. The letter said it took 2 years before Roger stopped having violent outbursts, and another year before he could talk about his mum without shutting down completely. She wrote that she never told him the full truth about what his mum went through raising him alone, how they'd lived in a tiny flat with mold on the walls because that's all his mum could afford on her wages from the cleaning job. She didn't tell him about the times his mum cried because she couldn't buy him new shoes, or how she'd skip meals so Roger could eat. The aunt said she wanted Roger to remember his mum as someone who loved him, not as someone who suffered because of Dad's choices. The letter explained that Roger tracked Dad down when he was 13 by going through his mum's old papers and finding an address. He took 2 buses to get there and waited outside Dad's office building for 3 hours until Dad came out. Roger said he just wanted to meet him, to ask why he left. But when Dad walked past without recognizing him, something inside Roger broke. He followed Dad down the street, and when Dad stopped to make a phone call in a quiet spot, Roger confronted him. The aunt wrote that according to Roger's account at the trial, Dad said he didn't have time for this and tried to walk away. That's when Roger pulled out the knife he'd been carrying for protection in his rough neighborhood and stabbed Dad in the thigh. Roger ran immediately and turned himself in 3 days later because he couldn't live with what he'd done. The aunt finished the letter by saying she never imagined Roger would cross paths with Dad's other family decades later, that she thought moving away and giving him a fresh start would mean the past stayed buried. She wrote that she was sorry for not being honest with me when I came asking questions, but she'd spent so many years protecting Roger from his painful history that her first instinct was to keep the secret, even when it was clearly hurting everyone involved. I folded the letter and sat there feeling this weird mix of sympathy and anger that I couldn't untangle. Roger was a hurt kid who did something terrible, but he was also a grown man who'd lied to me for 18 months and put me in this impossible situation. Understanding why he stabbed Dad didn't make it okay that he hid who he was while dating me and planning a wedding. I kept thinking about how he must have felt seeing Dad at the ceremony, recognizing the man he'd tried to hurt all those years ago, and I wondered if some part of him had always known this would end badly. The
next morning, Mum picked me up from Caroline's flat and we drove to the hospital together to visit Dad. She'd been quiet on the phone when I called to arrange it, and I could tell she was nervous about the conversation we needed to have. We sat in Dad's room watching him breathe with his eyes half open and unfocused, and I finally asked her to tell me everything about Dad's relationship with Roger's mum. Mum stared at Dad's face for a long time before she started talking. She said Dad met Roger's mum at a pub about 6 months before he and Mum started dating seriously. It was a brief thing that lasted maybe 2 months, and then the woman told Dad she was pregnant. Mum said Dad panicked because he was young and scared and didn't feel ready to be a father. He sent one payment of £500 with a note saying he couldn't be involved, and then he cut off all contact. The woman tried to reach him a few times after Roger was born, but Dad ignored her calls and letters. Mum found out about it 2 years into their marriage when Dad confessed during a fight about something else. She said she was angry at him for abandoning his child, but by then Roger would have been about 5 years old, and Dad insisted it was too late to suddenly show up and disrupt the kid's life. Mum told me she pushed Dad to at least send money or try to establish some kind of relationship, but Dad refused. He said he'd made his choice and he didn't want to open that door because it would complicate everything. Mum admitted she should have pushed harder, that she should have insisted Dad take responsibility, but she let it go because she didn't want to fight about it constantly. She said that was one of her biggest regrets, that she'd been complicit in Dad's abandonment by not forcing the issue. Then Mum said something that surprised me. She told me she was angry at Dad for creating the situation that led to all this pain. Roger grew up without a father because Dad was too scared to step up, and that abandonment shaped Roger's whole life in ways that eventually brought him to that moment when he stabbed Dad. Mum said she would have supported Dad having a relationship with Roger if he'd been honest from the start, that she would have helped figure out how to make it work. But instead, Dad hid it and left a child to grow up feeling rejected and unwanted. She said what Roger did at 13 was wrong, but Dad's choices created the circumstances that made a traumatized kid angry enough to do something violent. I sat there processing what Mum was saying and feeling this growing sense of betrayal toward both my parents. Dad abandoned his first child and never took responsibility for how that affected Roger's life, and Mum knew about it but didn't push hard enough to make Dad do the right thing. Now I was left managing the consequences of their choices, sitting in a hospital room with a father who couldn't speak while my half-brother, who I'd almost married, was somewhere dealing with his own trauma. I felt angry at Dad for being a coward who ran away from his responsibilities, and I felt angry at Mum for letting him get away with it. Both of them had kept secrets that shaped my life without me knowing, and now I had to figure out how to move forward with this knowledge that changed everything about my family history. Dr. Melina came in while we were sitting there and asked if she could give us an update on Dad's condition. She pulled up a chair and explained that Dad had been stable for the past week, but showed no meaningful improvement in his awareness or responsiveness. She said the brain scans revealed extensive damage from the oxygen deprivation during his heart attack, and the areas controlling higher cognitive functions were severely affected. Dr. Melina said Dad was in what they call a minimally conscious state, where he might have some limited awareness of his surroundings, but couldn't communicate or interact in any purposeful way. She told us that patients in this condition sometimes show small improvements over time, but given Dad's age and the extent of his injuries, significant recovery was unlikely. Then Dr. Melina suggested we start thinking about transferring Dad to a long-term care facility that specializes in patients with severe brain injuries. She said the hospital was meant for acute care, and Dad needed a place where he could receive appropriate long-term support and monitoring. She gave us brochures for 3 different facilities in the area and said she could help arrange tours, so we could see which one felt right. Dr. Melina was gentle but clear when she said we needed to prepare ourselves for the possibility that Dad might never regain more awareness than he had now, that this could be his permanent state. She said our job wasn't to hope for miracles that probably wouldn't come, but to make sure Dad was comfortable and cared for in whatever time he had left. Mum and I left the hospital feeling heavy with the weight of decisions we needed to make. 2 days later, I met with Portia at her office to finalize the annulment paperwork. She told me Roger had signed everything without contest and hadn't asked for anything or tried to delay the process. Portia said the annulment should be processed within 6 weeks, and then legally it would be as if the engagement never happened. The whole thing felt weird and anticlimactic given everything else that was going on, but I knew it was necessary to protect myself from any future claims Roger might make. Portia asked if I wanted to pursue any legal action against Roger for fraud or emotional distress, but I said no. I just wanted to move forward and put as much distance between us as possible. Then Portia helped me start the process of negotiating with all the wedding vendors to try to recover some of our deposits. We'd put down payments on the venue, the caterer, the photographer, the florist, and a bunch of other services that were now useless. Portia drafted letters explaining the medical emergency and requesting refunds based on the circumstances, and over the next week we heard back from most of them. Some vendors were sympathetic and refunded 50 or 60% of what we'd paid, but others stuck to their contracts and refused to give anything back. In the end, we recovered about 40% of the total deposits, which was better than nothing but still meant I'd lost thousands of pounds. I tried not to think about the money too much because there were bigger problems to deal with, but it stung knowing that my failed wedding was going to cost me financially on top of everything else.
My work supervisor called me in for a meeting to discuss my situation and figure out what arrangement would work going forward. I'd already used all my vacation time, and the unpaid leave I'd taken was starting to affect project deadlines. I explained that I needed to be available for Dad's medical appointments and the transition to a care facility, and that I couldn't commit to full-time hours right now. My supervisor was understanding and said she could approve a reduced schedule where I'd work 3 days a week instead of 5, handling the most critical parts of my role while other team members covered the rest. The pay cut would be significant, maybe 30% less than my normal salary, but it was better than losing my job completely. I accepted the arrangement and thanked her for being flexible, then went back to Caroline's flat feeling stressed about money. Caroline and Tony sat me down that evening and told me they wouldn't accept rent money while I was staying with them. Tony said they had the extra room and they wanted to help, and Caroline said I needed to save my resources for all the medical and legal expenses coming my way. I tried to argue, but they were firm about it, and I felt grateful but also uncomfortable being dependent on their generosity. The following Tuesday, I attended a caregiver support group at the hospital that Dr. Melina had recommended. The group met in a conference room on the 3rd floor and consisted of about 8 people whose family members had severe brain injuries or were in similar states of minimal consciousness. A social worker named Helen ran the group and started by asking everyone to share a bit about their situation. I listened to other people talk about their husbands, wives, parents, and children who'd been in accidents, or had strokes, or suffered other medical crises that left them unable to communicate. One woman described caring for her husband for 6 years after a motorcycle accident, visiting him every day even though he never showed any sign of recognizing her. A man talked about his teenage daughter who'd been in a coma for 8 months before waking up in a minimally conscious state where she remained for another 3 years. Everyone in the room understood the specific kind of grief that comes from loving someone who's physically present but mentally absent, and hearing their stories made me feel less alone in what I was going through. Helen talked about the importance of accepting that recovery might not happen the way we hope, and that our job as caregivers is to focus on quality of life and comfort, rather than chasing unlikely improvements. She said we needed to give ourselves permission to live our own lives while supporting our family members, that we couldn't put everything on hold indefinitely waiting for someone to wake up. The group helped me start accepting that Dad might never wake up fully, that his current state might be permanent, and that I needed to figure out how to move forward while still making sure he was cared for properly. 2 days after the support group meeting, Detective Pratt called and asked if he could stop by Caroline's flat to update me on the investigation. He arrived that afternoon with a folder under his arm and sat across from me at the kitchen table while Caroline made herself scarce in the bedroom. He opened the folder and showed me witness statements, employment records, and security footage that confirmed Roger was at his job the night of the mugging, nowhere near London when Dad got attacked. The detective explained that the 3 masked men were never identified, and the case file showed no connection to Roger beyond the newspaper clippings we'd found in his flat. He said the attack was random street crime, wrong place, wrong time, and Roger's obsession with the news coverage was about monitoring Dad's condition after years of guilt, not because he'd planned anything. I felt this weird mix of relief and frustration because at least Roger didn't orchestrate Dad getting stabbed, but the men who actually did it were still out there and probably always would be. Detective Pratt closed his folder and told me he was marking the investigation complete. Then he shook my hand and left. The following week, Portia called saying Roger had sent a letter through her office requesting permission to visit Dad one time to apologize for what he did at 13. She read parts of it over the phone where Roger talked about needing closure and wanting to tell Dad he was sorry before it was too late, and he promised the visit would be supervised with hospital staff present if I allowed it. I told Portia I needed time to think about it, and hung up feeling angry that Roger was asking me for anything after what he'd put me through. That Thursday, I brought the letter to my therapy session with Raven, and we spent the hour talking about whether letting Roger see Dad would help me find closure, or just create more confusion and pain. Raven asked what I hoped would happen during the visit, and I realized I didn't know. That part of me wanted Roger to apologize, so I could see if it changed how I felt about him. But another part of me wanted to keep him away from Dad forever as punishment. We talked about the difference between forgiveness and allowing contact, and Raven helped me understand that I could let Roger visit without forgiving him, that the two things weren't connected. By the end of the session, I decided to allow one supervised visit, because Dad deserved to hear an apology even if he couldn't understand it, and because refusing felt like I was protecting Roger from consequences rather than protecting Dad. I called Portia the next day and told her Roger could visit once with me and a hospital staff member present, and she said she'd arrange it for the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. The days leading up to the visit made me anxious, and I kept second-guessing my decision, but Caroline reminded me I could end the visit any time if it felt wrong. Tuesday arrived and I got to the hospital an hour early, sitting with Dad and telling him Roger was coming even though Dad's eyes stayed half open and distant like they always did. A nurse named Alicia came in at 1:45 and positioned herself near the door, and then Roger walked in looking pale and nervous, his hands shaking as he pulled a chair up beside Dad's bed. He sat there for a minute without saying anything, just staring at Dad's face, and then he started talking quietly about being 13 and angry, and how he'd blamed Dad for everything wrong in his life after his mom died. Roger's voice cracked when he talked about tracking Dad down and confronting him, about the moment he pulled the knife and stabbed him in the thigh, about running away and getting arrested and spending 2 years in juvenile detention thinking about what he'd done. He told Dad about his aunt taking him in and moving them away from London, about therapy and trying to become a better person, about his mum dying without ever seeing Dad again. Roger cried while he apologized for the pain he caused and for not being strong enough to find Dad properly as an adult, instead of letting anger control him as a kid. I watched Dad's face the whole time looking for any sign he could hear or understand, but he just lay there with his eyes half open, and that distant, empty look that meant his mind was somewhere unreachable. Roger kept talking about wishing things had been different, about wanting to know Dad as a father instead of as someone he hated, and his voice got quieter until he was almost whispering. The whole visit lasted maybe 20 minutes before Roger ran out of words and just sat there crying with his head in his hands. Alicia, the nurse, stayed by the door the entire time watching everything, and I stood near the window feeling this complicated mess of anger at both of them, and sadness for the relationship they never had and never would have now. When Roger finally stood up, he wiped his eyes and turned to me, thanking me for allowing the visit, and saying he knew it was hard for me to be there. He promised to respect my boundaries going forward, and said he was committed to therapy and to understanding why he made the choices he did. And then he said he hoped someday I might be willing to have some kind of relationship as siblings, even though he understood if that never happened. I told him I couldn't think about future relationships right now, that I needed to focus on grieving the life I thought I had and building something new for myself. Roger nodded and said he understood. Then he left the room without looking back at Dad. Alicia asked if I was okay, and I said yes, even though I wasn't sure. And after she left, I sat with Dad for another hour trying to process what had just happened. The relief I felt surprised me because even though nothing was resolved, the immediate crisis felt like it was settling into something more manageable, something I could live with even if I'd never fully understand it. 3 days later, Mum and I drove to the long-term care facility Dr. Melina had recommended, a place called Riverside Care about 30 minutes from the hospital. We met with the director, a woman in her 50s who showed us around the building and explained their approach to patients with minimal consciousness. The facility was clean and professional with wide hallways and rooms that had windows looking out at a garden, and the staff we passed all seemed calm and patient with the residents. The director took us to a room that would be Dad's and showed us how they'd arrange his bed and medical equipment, and she talked about their daily routines for turning patients and checking vitals and providing comfort care. Mum asked questions about visiting hours and emergency procedures while I looked around the room trying to picture Dad living here for months or years or maybe the rest of his life. The director seemed genuinely caring when she talked about treating patients with dignity, even when they couldn't communicate, and that helped ease some of the guilt I felt about moving Dad out of the acute hospital where he'd been since the wedding. We signed the paperwork that afternoon and arranged for Dad's transfer to happen the following Monday. The weekend before the move, I spent Saturday afternoon at the hospital, organizing what would go with Dad to the new facility. I brought a small photo album with pictures of him and Mum from before the attack, and some pictures of me as a kid that I thought he might have liked, even though I didn't know if he could see or understand them anymore. I packed his clothes and toiletries and a blanket from home, trying to create some sense of familiarity in a place that would be strange and new. Monday morning came and I watched the medical transport team carefully move Dad from his hospital bed onto a stretcher, and I followed the ambulance in my car to Riverside Care where staff helped settle him into his new room. I spent the afternoon arranging his photos on a shelf and hanging a small painting Mum had brought, and I adjusted the blinds so natural light came in without being too bright. The director stopped by to check on us and said I could visit any time during their extended hours, and that made me feel better about leaving Dad there. That week in therapy, Raven and I worked on processing my anger at Dad for abandoning Roger and creating this whole situation in the first place. She had me write letters to Dad that I'd never send, letters where I could say everything I felt about his choices and the pain he caused without worrying about his reaction or my mum's feelings. I wrote about being disappointed that he walked away from his first child, about being angry that he never told me I had a brother, about grieving that I'd never get to confront him about any of it because his brain was too damaged to have that conversation. Writing the letters helped me separate my love for Dad from my anger at his choices, and Raven said that was healthy and normal and necessary for moving forward. I also wrote letters to Roger that I didn't send, trying to sort out my feelings about him being both a hurt child who made a terrible choice and an adult who deceived me and violated my trust. Raven helped me see that both things could be true at the same time, that understanding Roger's childhood trauma didn't excuse the lies he told me or the way he hid his identity throughout our relationship. She said I could have compassion for what Roger went through as a kid while still being angry about what he did as an adult, and that holding both feelings didn't make me a bad person or mean I was confused. The letters helped me work through the tangle of emotions I felt every time I thought about Roger, and by the end of the session, I felt a little less overwhelmed by the whole mess. 3 months passed and I settled into a pattern that felt almost normal. I worked 3 days a week at the office, visited Dad at Riverside Care on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and saw Raven every Thursday afternoon. The routine helped me feel steady, even when everything inside still felt broken. I could get through a whole day without crying now, could eat regular meals, could sleep 6 hours most nights. It wasn't happiness, but it was functioning, and Raven said that counted as real progress after everything that happened. One evening, Caroline and Tony asked me to sit down with them in their living room.
Tony made tea while Caroline perched on the arm of the sofa looking nervous. She said they loved having me there, and I could stay as long as I needed, but they wondered if I'd thought about finding my own place. I felt my stomach drop because part of me wanted to hide in their guest room forever where I felt safe. Tony jumped in quickly, saying it wasn't about wanting me gone, it was about helping me take back control of my life. Caroline nodded and said living independently might help me feel stronger, help me prove to myself that I could handle things on my own. I knew they were right even though the idea scared me. I'd been engaged and planning a future with Roger just months ago, and now I had to build a completely different life from scratch. That weekend, I started looking at flats online, focusing on places with good security systems and doormen. I needed to feel safe, needed to know someone was watching who came and went from the building. Caroline came with me to view a studio apartment in a newer building near the city center. It had a security entrance, cameras in the hallways, and a doorman who worked from 8 in the morning until midnight. The flat itself was small but bright with big windows and enough space for a bed, a small sofa, and a kitchen area. The rent was higher than I wanted to pay, but my reduced work schedule just barely covered it. I signed the lease that afternoon before I could talk myself out of it. Caroline helped me move in 2 weeks later with basic furniture from a discount store. We assembled a bed frame together, hung cheap curtains, and arranged a small bookshelf I'd bought. Setting up my own space felt strange, like I was playing house instead of actually living. That first night alone, I jumped at every sound. The building settled and creaked, neighbors walked past in the hallway, the elevator dinged on other floors. I kept checking the locks on my door, looking through the peephole, making sure no one was out there. Around 2 in the morning, I finally fell asleep with all the lights on. The next day, I called Mom and asked if she wanted to visit Dad with me. We met at Riverside Care and walked to his room together. Dad lay in his bed with his eyes half open, staring at nothing. Mom touched his hand gently while I adjusted his blankets. We sat there in silence for a while before Mom said she was sorry for keeping secrets about Roger's mother. She said she should have pushed Dad harder to take responsibility for his first son, should have made him face what he'd done instead of letting him pretend it never happened. I told her I was sorry too. Sorry for judging her choices without understanding how complicated her marriage to Dad really was. She squeezed my hand and said we were both doing our best with a situation neither of us created. We agreed to be honest with each other going forward, to share the responsibility of Dad's care instead of carrying it separately. It felt good to clear the air between us, to build something real instead of the polite distance we'd had before. A few days later, Roger's aunt called and asked if she could pass along a message from Roger. I said yes, as long as it stayed brief. She told me Roger was still in therapy twice a week, that he'd joined a group for men dealing with childhood trauma and abandonment. He wanted me to know he was working on understanding why he made the choices he did, taking responsibility instead of making excuses. The aunt said Roger wasn't asking for contact or forgiveness, just wanted me to know he was trying to heal properly this time. I thanked her for telling me and said I appreciated knowing Roger was getting help, even though I wasn't ready to talk to him directly. It helped somehow, knowing he was facing his issues instead of running from them. The following Tuesday, I met with Dr. Melina during my regular visit to Dad. She pulled up his charts and showed me the brain scans from the past 3 months. Dad's condition had stayed exactly the same with no improvements or declines. His brain activity remained minimal, his responses non-existent. She said some patients stay in this state for years or even decades, that there was no way to predict if Dad would ever show more awareness than he had right now. I asked if I was doing enough by visiting twice a week, and she said yes, absolutely. She told me the best thing I could do was visit when I could manage it emotionally, make sure Dad was comfortable and cared for by the facility staff, and otherwise live my life fully. Holding on to hope for a miracle would only drain me, she said. I needed to accept that this might be Dad's permanent condition and find a way to move forward anyway. Her honesty hurt, but I needed to hear it. That weekend, I saw a flyer at the hospital for a support group that met monthly for families dealing with complicated grief and family trauma. I attended the next meeting in a small conference room where 8 other people sat in a circle. The facilitator asked us to introduce ourselves and share briefly what brought us there. I listened to stories about parents with dementia, siblings who'd committed crimes, children lost to addiction, families torn apart by secrets and lies. When my turn came, I gave the basic outline of my situation without going into detail. Just saying the words out loud to strangers felt lighter somehow, like spreading the weight across more shoulders. After the meeting, a woman around my age approached me and said my story resonated with her. Her brother had hidden his drug addiction for years before overdosing, and she understood the feeling of being lied to by someone you loved. We exchanged numbers, and she invited me to come back next month. Over the next few weeks, I kept attending the support group meetings. I started sharing more of my experience, and other people's stories helped me see my situation from different angles. A man whose father had abandoned his family said he understood Roger's anger even if he didn't excuse the violence. A woman whose husband hid a gambling addiction said she knew what it felt like to question everything about a relationship. Helping other people process their pain gave me a sense of purpose beyond just surviving my own mess. It reminded me I wasn't alone in dealing with family secrets and betrayal, that other people had walked through similar fires and come out the other side. 6 months after the wedding, that never happened. I sat in my studio apartment on a Saturday morning drinking tea. Sunlight came through the windows and I could hear the city waking up outside. Dad was settled at Riverside Care where staff checked on him regularly and kept him comfortable.
Mom and I talked twice a week and visited Dad together when we could. Roger was working on his healing from a safe distance through his aunt's updates. I was learning to forgive myself for not seeing the truth sooner, for trusting someone who lied to me, for being angry at Dad even though he couldn't defend himself. Life wasn't fixed and I wasn't healed completely. I still had bad days where the anger came back strong, where I questioned every choice I'd made, where I felt overwhelmed by everything that happened. But I also had good days now, days where I felt steady and capable, days where I could see a future beyond this trauma. My apartment was mine, my routine was mine, my choices were mine. I was safe and functional and slowly building something real from the wreckage. That felt like enough for now. And that wraps it up. I love when simple stories remind us how much we can still learn or improve. If this one sparked an idea, that's the goal. Subscribe so you'll be here when the next one drops.